they shall be my sons, and in them will live the hopes of a unified humanity. Theirs will be the strength to prevail, not only when victory lies within easy reach, but even when it seems unattainable, when doom settles like a shroud all about. In those times of darkness, my noble sons will shine the brightest. The age of strife was a period of collapse for human civilization. The galaxy-spanning empire brought humanity to its knees, left crawling across the ground, broken and bloodied. Hope had been all but extinguished, and those who remained, though they knew nothing of the remnants scattered across the galaxy, would consider them lost amid the firestorm of horror. They entered into a downward spiral where we would see the sometimes literal cannibalization of whatever remained of their former glorious and proud galactic civilizations. There were dotted beacons of light clinging to the remnants of what had come before, but their hope of ever being reunited was more myth than reality. After the decay and ashes arose a figure who came to be known as the Emperor of Mankind. It was only by his knowledge, determination, and power that mankind would survive. His wisdom and vision would become humanity's guiding light out of the darkness, long into the millennia ahead. Many figures and institutions during this time would become instrumental in the reconstruction and safeguarding of mankind's future. And this key initial period comes around the end of the 30th and the beginning of the 31st millennium. Toward the end period of M30, the Emperor's Thunder Warriors were still forcibly dragging humanity back out of the filth it had wallowed in for so long. They would achieve this not by acting as its benevolent liberators, but by harrowing traumatic force in what was misleadingly titled the Unification Wars. For anything unifying about this time would be that the Thunder Warriors' campaign of blunt force trauma executed upon the surviving remnants of humanity as they rampaged across all of Earth. And during this time, the Emperor had no need or desire for true or meaningful diplomacy. The days where humanity had seen true civil discussion had ceased long ago, and any dialogue he entered into seemed to be almost philosophical or ideological entertainment, purely for his own amusement, before all were crushed under his authoritarian dictatorial rule. There was only ever going to be one truly acceptable choice to be made by a settlement upon being informed as to the approaching presence of the Golden Warrior and his army. Their choice was simply subjugation or annihilation. And we know all about those who choose to deal in absolutes. The Emperor would enact his will without mercy, and in truth, never sincerely entertaining those who presented arguments challenging his right to supreme and unquestioning authority over the lives of all mankind. The Emperor held the firm and defiant belief that his way was the only way forward, leading humanity out from the Psychic darkness that had enveloped it, whilst simultaneously saving it from itself and its inevitable human flaws that he had seen played out across millennia. Once he'd chosen to walk down this path, it seemed certain that for the Emperor, no alternative would be considered. On Earth, the leaders of human settlements and territories who held too much pride or who carried an inflated sense of their own importance would hold hasty discussions. They would raise the expectations of their communities and make grand, impressive speeches addressing these reports of an unstoppable army, which they argued were undoubtedly exaggerated by propaganda and fear. They would tell their citizens how surely, with determination and grit, they could all pull together and weather this brazen warmonger, as they had done so many warlords seeking territorial expansion before him across the centuries. But for those who had listened to the ignorant promises of their so-called leaders, they would only discover the enormity of their error, the folly of their pride, as they laid eyes upon the army of the Emperor, his mighty superhuman warriors of thunder standing shoulder to shoulder, an unbreakable visible wall of power. and this would sometimes be enough in and of itself to leave those who thought too much of themselves running, screaming from the battlefield in terror. But for others who felt too committed, their poor judgment would become an object lesson in consequence. Even when their obliteration was assured by means of the initial volley from the Thunder Warriors' proto-bolt guns, the grenade-sized rounds leaving the often largely civilian militia ripped to shreds in appalling horror, this would seemingly not be enough for the Emperor. He would act to ensure that none should have a question or forget his authority, his unbreakable force of will. His Thunder Warriors strode across the battlefield, brutalizing and crushing those who dared to stand against the will of the Emperor, or simply those who remained in their path, in the most obscene ways. Heads crushed under boots and by fists, eyes gouged, limbs torn, and still living bodies cleaved in two. The sights and sounds of the abject horrors rained down upon those who sought to defy the will of the Emperor, and enough would survive to flee screaming to tell of the horror, so as to ensure their failed defiance would stand as a stark warning to any who might dare to question or suggest any doubt as to who was the true and destined leader of Terra, and who would in the coming years lead humanity through the all-enveloping darkness of this new age. Yet even as the Thunder Warriors battled onward with unquestioning loyalty in their task for the Emperor, one of the darkest secrets of the Imperium would occur. And to be sure, any record of this is long since purged, anyone with knowledge or suggestion of it executed. For the Emperor had long been developing a new weapon by which he would lead the next phase of his plan to travel beyond Terra and reunite humanity from what he saw as inevitable self-destruction. The Thunder Warriors, effective as they were, had served their purpose as the Emperor's hammer, which he used to reforge humanity from a broken and tribalistic people into a united empire. But in order for this to happen, the Emperor would need a new tool of conquest, and this was a role for which the Thunder Warriors were not at all suited, because it would require careful planning, coordination, diplomacy, restraint, and even ideological subtlety. It would be unfair to say that the Thunder Warriors were incapable of such attributes, but they were poorly suited to take on this role. Fantastic fighters, less so diplomats, and even though they were in some respects more powerful than those who would replace them, their short human lifespans would not be compatible with the galactic campaign proposed now by the Emperor. The one thing we can be certain of is that the Emperor would ultimately have the Thunder Warriors slaughtered, using a final battle at the end of his unification wars as a flimsy cover. This premise is obviously weak, as it seems highly unlikely that a force previously unchallenged could suddenly be randomly obliterated. In fact, some did survive the Emperor's purge and lived on to tell the truth of their experience. In truth, the ultimate fate of the Thunder Warriors is unclear and how it came about, but it seems the most likely situation is that the Emperor betrayed his Thunder Warriors and slaughtered them, either himself or that he had his custodian guard perform the task, who would live on beyond these early beginnings. One other alternative is that the Emperor had not strictly originally sought their extermination. Perhaps he had some other plan. But it's possible the Thunder Warriors learned the Emperor was creating a new force of superhumans. In fact, we know that they knew this. And seeing these new, more advanced warriors with extended lifespans, they felt cheated or betrayed, and some rebelled against the Emperor, forcing his hand and leading to a final battle of which few would survive. Only the way it is, a bloody stain the Emperor would prefer none remembered. It's one of many unfortunate incidents covered up by those closest to the Emperor, and for anyone to dare speak of this now would be an almost certain death sentence. Tragically for the Thunder Warriors, neither the premise nor trigger for their destruction seems largely relevant now, because whatever the cause, it would still coincide with the emergence of the Emperor's newest warriors. The Astartes, known more commonly, of course, to citizens of humanity's galactic empire as the Space Marines. In time, they would reunite humanity through the Emperor's Great Crusade. Their ongoing mission now, as it was then, would be not to lead humanity itself, but to stand as its ultimate defenders, its guardians and wards, even if this means taking some actions to protect it from itself. Of course, in the modern age of the Imperium, the role of the Astartes has shifted to at least some degree, most specifically now that the Ultramarines Primarch has proactively taken over the role as Lord Commander of the Imperium, replacing the stagnant, often self-serving, and regularly ineffective council known as the High Lords of Terra. In a widest sense, though, the Astartes stand as they have for some 10,000 years, and of all they were designed for and best suited to, theirs is the supreme defenders of all mankind. The Emperor's grand vision for the future of humanity had begun long before his march across old Earth during the Unification Wars. The Emperor's ultimate and true grand vision can only be guessed at, but it's something I'll likely expand upon in the next episode of the Emperor series. From what's required here, though, we know that he'd planned to create warriors who would reunite and lead humanity into a new golden age, one which would enable them to escape the pitfalls and horrors of the past. Most importantly, disconnected from the fear and mythology that had reared its head and dragged mankind back into the Dark Ages throughout the Age of Strife. But one important thing to know is that the 20 legions of Space Marines, they're not really springing forth from vast production chambers, as did later the Primaris. The first recruits to become Astartes would steadily be tested and eventually recruited from those already on Terra during this time. To lead each of his legions and act as his closest commanders, he would create the Primarchs. The origin of the Primarchs is at a base level relatively straightforward. The Emperor would use his own DNA as a template, spliced with other elements that were at least seemingly, in some cases, apparently animal DNA. And this enabled him to produce 20 sons, who would in turn become the templates for his new legions. These ultimate warriors would be second only to the Emperor himself, and they were to all intents and purposes demigod-like figures. They were not simply powerful warriors, but also imbued with traits that mirrored much of the Emperor himself. Mysterious genetic gifts of seemingly supernatural power, such as irresistible charisma, persuasive diplomacy, or devastating tactical prowess. This, coupled with a vast extended lifespan, meant that they were as close to being immortal as was possible in what is still technically a mortal human body. They also held near-complete resistance to disease or other harmful pathogens, superior healing power, and godlike physical strength. A Primarch can easily be seen by ordinary humans, despite their personal protestations otherwise, as a godlike figure akin to those of ancient mythology. Additionally, each Primarch holds masterful individual expertise that sets them apart from each of their brothers. For example, one Primarch may hold immense psychic power, but not equal to the Emperor himself. Another could exhibit, as I said, already unrivaled tactical skill, a mastery of stealth and subterfuge, or a Primarch could even, in all respects, be a literal embodiment of war itself. But for whatever reason, there was a degree of disparity between each of their personal gifts. Some Primarchs, like Rogel Dorn, were seemingly dealt the short end of the stick, given the godlike mastery of building walls. But it's someone with a history of building the family. I'll always be one to appreciate some good clean pointing to a bit of a wall. Yet, at the same time, doing tidy brickwork doesn't seem on the same level as being a tactical world-building genius like Guilliman, say. Or, If you are Primarch of the Salamanders, Vulcan, gifted with, oh, you know, just literal immortality as a perpetual. I think whoever was waiting in line after Vulcan was thinking, wow, he got immortality. What gift will I get next? Well, it was Corvus, Primarch of the Raven Guard, imbued with the power of being a master at hit-and-run attacks. It must have been thinking to himself, well, he can't have everything, can you? In all seriousness, though, the Primarchs were gifted with astonishing powers far beyond mortal capability. While they were universally superior in all respects, somewhat unrivaled masters in more traditional matters like warfare and diplomacy, in stark contrast were those boasting the supernatural traits. But this shouldn't position them in the mind as being any less capable, powerful, or important. The disparity of personal traits seems best interpreted as being perhaps not by design even, because while the Emperor and his gene rights were undoubtedly highly skilled, the fact is that some of his Primarch's DNA is believed to have contained what he described as flawed aspects that were not visible at first. Now, it's difficult to know whether it happened at this stage or whether it was a process later of complications around genetic degradation and replication. But whatever the reason, these genetic issues would eventually present themselves in a legion and go on to become problematic, especially for Chaos, but also for chapters of the Second Founding to this day. And it points towards one possibility of a more experimental aspect. Well, not every outcome or consequence of their genetic development of the Primarchs was fully known by the Emperor. I think personally it is reasonable to suggest, and I think it also sits in line with what we know about the Emperor, that he did not fully know with certainty the outcome of each of his Primarch designs, and that by using his own DNA, he would likely be gifting each with a very powerful attribute, but he just couldn't know which, and he couldn't know how successfully or stable each Primarch was going to be. I think it's in line, as I say, with the Emperors sometimes appearing to have a definitive plan and a strategy, and other times just doing whatever he feels in his gut is the best way forward. But before the Primarchs could be fully realized, they were stolen from the Emperor's laboratory and distributed across the galaxy. And this would leave him and his burgeoning legions of Space Marines to embark on a great crusade, finally reuniting these legions with their Primarchs. It should have been the dawn of a new age for mankind, but instead, despite their inhuman mastery of specific traits and powers, it was ultimately the Primarchs' inherent and inescapable humanity which would be revealed as perhaps their greatest flaw, finally leading to their corruption and downfall. But the result of this heresy was a never-tightening of the psychic relationship between humanity and those beings which inhabit the very darkest reaches of the warp. The Primarch's flawed nature, coupled with the Emperor's inability to see far enough into the future, or perhaps his inability to distinguish which reality was the true path forward, led to his Primarchs nearly causing the destruction of his new empire, and of course, his own personal demise. Now, just before anybody starts foaming at the mouth, this is of course the condensed basic version of events, and I've omitted a fair few elements because his story is as interesting as it can be glossed over for now with a summary. The more fleshed-out version contains the details related to the intervention of Chaos, which would lead us to the events where the powers of Chaos would scatter the still-developing Primarchs across the galaxy. Potentially some were damaged in transit. This would become an additional reason as to why the Emperor would embark upon his great crusade, as he would quest to rediscover the Primarchs, uniting them with the Space Marine legions, and more importantly, bringing them back under his command as part of the germinating Imperium. Now, it should be a little careful here because we're primarily talking about Space Marines and not the Emperor, and this section of history could easily sprawl into multiple tangents entirely about the Emperor, his exploits, and grandiose plans for humanity. But the core of the issue is a journey that is generally accepted as having taken place, which occurred before the development of the Primarchs. By all available information, this was likely during the Dark Age of technology, where the Emperor, not traveling under that title, of course, along with some other companions, would visit the world known as Molech. And I will also just make one aside here because I've often seen people asking about this. How was it that the Emperor was a giant? From our understanding of his physical body in comparison to Astartes and Primarchs, how could he have remained hidden among ordinary humans during the Dark Age before this time on the old Earth? I also think this was fairly self-explanatory myself, and the answer is because he's the Emperor. But also, with someone of his psychic powers, even before he visited, it seems reasonable to assume that he was either able to shield people's vision of his true self. There is the possibility that even before, as I say, this visit to Molech, his physical stature was just simply different. I would lean in on just his either being able to actually change or control his own physique through his power, although he was able to just cloud people's minds to his true form. You can really take your pick, because in the scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. So Molech is where the Emperor would enter a warp portal and emerge with even greater powers and knowledge than he held previously. And this is why it's commonly believed that he gained the advanced knowledge required to create his Primarchs. And this was again during the Dark Age of technology. The Emperor is speculated to have made a deal with the gods of chaos to acquire power and knowledge, but never having any intention to fulfill what he actually promised. Maybe he promised the souls of humanity. Maybe it was his own eternal soul. After all, he was meant to have been formed by a process that, whichever origin story you want to subscribe to, was designed to evade the darkness of the warp. But with all these events, it's something that I believe no one can really ever truly say with any certainty. The details of this are all the subject of great speculation, but assuming the Emperor did interact with the dark powers of the warp, whatever the Emperor promised, for now, is to me quite irrelevant. Later down the line, if we have some more information about his grander plans, and we have some concrete information there, it may form part of a larger picture in context. But at the moment, it's not the most important, because what is that he had no intention of honoring it, which subsequently, understandably, has clearly angered the entities of chaos. Some believe that the Emperor has always been all-powerful ever since he was birthed as a godlike entity, and that he simply needed to enter the warp not in order to gain power, but to acquire additional knowledge from the ethereal realm in order to create the Primarchs. Or who knows? Perhaps there is even some other, as yet unknown reason. But I believe that this acquisition of knowledge is certainly an acceptable, valid rationalization, and that the Chaos Gods were simply angered by the Emperor's plan and his end goal, regardless of whatever he was doing at Molech at that specific time. And that then this is entirely unrelated to their actions directly. And it is suggested as well that the warp is more than just a sea of souls, but it actually contains the sum total of knowledge in the galaxy, or indeed, the universe. Cawl of the Mechanicum believed that he could access this using his constructed device, which was of course doomed to fail. Yet, he suggested to us that perhaps the Emperor needed to enter the warp via the portal at Molech in order to reacquire knowledge he knew he was going to need for his projects. Maybe this was the only way he could gain that. We also know that the Chaos Gods will unite and work together when they have a sense of a severe and imminent threat in material space. So the Emperor need not have literally interacted with them to trigger the response that would come. Moreover, no one should consider it a reliable or unbiased source. It was the Primarch Horus who told us how, at the dawn of the Great Diaspora, the Emperor traveled here in humble guise and found the gateway to a realm of immortal gods. He offered them things only a god-in-waiting could offer, and they trusted him. They gave him a measure of their power, and with that power, he wrought the science to unlock the mysteries of creation. But the Emperor had no intention of honoring his debt to the gods. He turned on them, taking their gifts and blending them with his gene-craft to give birth to demigods. The Emperor condemns the warp as unnatural, but only so no other dares wield it. The blood of the immaterial realm flows in my veins. It flows in all our veins. For as I am the Emperor's son, you are the sons of Horus. The secret of our genesis was unlocked upon Molech. The gateway to that power is in Nubra Kalia, far beneath the mountain rock, sealed away from the light by a jealous god who knew that someday one of his sons would seek to surpass his deeds. Quoted, of course, from the excellent heresy novel Vengeful Spirit. There are as well demons of the warp who have made mention of these events. In Caladian the Ascended would reveal the primordial truth to Lorgar, and accounts of perpetuals who accompanied the Emperor, like Olanius Pius or Erda. But in truth, who can know the reality of such matters at this point in time? Well, you might say, were we ever truly to know the way things played out? Whose version of events can you trust? If the Emperor returned to life today and laid it all out, could you take his word? Many would. But then this is the master of mankind, who told tales of his thunder warriors being slain in a glorious final battle, when it was probably his own hand, or at least his own orders, that put them in their graves. All we can say with a reasonable assumption is that the Emperor traveled to a warp portal located on the world of Molech during what is now referred to as the Dark Age of technology. Later, during the Great Crusade, Molech would be reconnected with mankind, brought under imperial rule. But the Emperor would extremely suspiciously erase the memory of his Primarchs who visited this world at that time, and what appears to have been a bid to prevent his Primarch sons from knowing of or feeling curious enough to investigate the existence of the warp portal here. His true motivations for doing this are unknown. It could have been done with the best of intentions to protect his sons from the darkness they would later become immersed in, or it could have been to retain his grip of ultimate power over the Imperium, or who knows what alternative bold, grandiose visions he may have had. Either way, by the time he reached the period of heresy, Horus himself would invade Molech, also at this time regaining his memory and subsequently entering the portal. And this would then enable him to acquire his immense powers, ultimately allowing him to wound the Emperor so severely so that even now he exists in his state of living death, locked into the golden throne on Terra. Now, while some may consider this narrative fairly established, for myself, I find the causal situations here to be less important than would be the results of the Emperor's engagements with the warp. Initially, to create the Primarchs, and then the ultimate consequence in the scattering of the Primarchs, thus leading to a staggered reunification and a fractured, slow, bleeding jealousy that would eat away at some of the Primarchs in their view of the Emperor, coupled with, in their eyes, his final abandonment of them. Could the misinterpretation and manipulation by demons related to these events, their cyclical nature, as they are seen by those who reside in the warp, the whole sequence of events related to the Emperor, the warp portal, the Primarchs, their cascade into darkness, all fall into a sequence that I've described previously in our exploration of the warp as a causal time loop? That is, a series of events in time with no discernible beginning or end. If you missed this, it was covered in Episode 1 of The Dark Origins of Chaos. But for the sake of our sanity, I'll put a pin in that. Because another question we might ask equally could be, were the Space Marines just another tool of the Emperor that he had planned to eventually discard as part of some grander plan, just as he had previously done so with the Thunder Warriors? In my opinion, the answer is yes. But I believe I'll save my thoughts on both these for the next installment of The Emperor of Man. Music. The original Space Marines were not a vast force of clones who had been developed and stood ready to be unleashed upon the galaxy en masse. They were slowly developed alongside both the Thunder Warriors and the Emperor's Primarch project in the 30th millennium. The efforts of gene wrights like Ezekiel Sedaine and, of course, Astartes were instrumental in the Astartes and Primarch projects. Their extreme efforts worked alongside an entire team of scientists to achieve the demanding requirements of the Emperor, and they spent every ounce of their energy in genetically modifying volunteer warriors for experimentation and development. Many of these would die. Their bodies rejected the heavy surgery and forced augmentation as their bodies were split from top to tail on slabs in experimental laboratories. The scientists toiled within the Emperor's facilities. Progress was grindingly slow, but they all hoped they would be able to develop stable systems for his new army. The whole development of the Astartes was very likely only possible to a large degree because of the original director of the Emperor's biotechnical division, and she was a woman known as Astarte, who gave her name to the project and to the eventual warriors of humanity. And she was one of the greatest scientists humanity has ever known. Likely only the Emperor exceeded her skill and knowledge. And it was her, not the Emperor, who's believed to have developed the prototype for the gene seed organ known as the Black Carapace, the means by which the Space Marines interact with their armor at a neurological level, enabling them to move and fight as if they were not wearing heavy plates of ceramite. But the Black Carapace is one of the major differences between Astartes and other power armor wearers like Inquisitors and the Sisters of Battle. The Sororitas, while they can still wear adapted power armor, they are not Astartes, so their bodies cannot interface properly with the armor and connect to it in the same way. This means that while they can move, it's not as natural or easy. But given the time, they can still learn to use it to good effect and have it be still more of a benefit than a hindrance in combat. But for all of her genius, the Black Carapace was an extremely troublesome organ to perfect. It would not easily replicate on candidates, or sometimes it would become overly aggressive. It was only with the combined help of Ezekiel Sedaine, later Belisarius Cawl, who would bring it to a stable and usable state. Sedaine would in fact like to replace Astarte as the head of the biotechnical division. And in many respects, this is something of a tragic tale, because although Astarte had been instrumental to the development of the Emperor's finest warriors, by the period of heresy in the 31st millennium, she had been somewhat forgotten about. Her inability to achieve the final success in the project led fellow scientists seeing her as something of a failure, even though this was very far from the truth. Sedaine would fare no better, though. His fate was far from that which he had spent so very long in planning. The early Astartes were not developed in isolation, though. Although they were initially sheathed with gray thunder armor and assigned what appeared to be arbitrary numerical designations, secretly, genetic material from each of the developing Primarchs had been used and implanted into candidates to transform them from merely powerful warriors to what we would come to know now as the Space Marines. Also, during this early developmental period, unlike the modern Astartes, Space Marines of the First Legions were recruited and genetically adapted from full adult specimens. It was only later that adolescence was seen as being best for recruitment, and the reason for this was primarily to enable better integration, acceptance, and development of the Astartes gene seed into their bodies. From the way it's often described, people commonly make the mistake of assuming that there was a distinct line where the Thunder Warriors ended and the Space Marines began. It's reasonable to see why this can happen. I've just done it myself in this video by describing the ultimate end of the Thunder Boys, followed by how they were succeeded by the Astartes, except that this is not the case as we know it. Initially, there was something of a mixed force of proto-Astartes, and this makes sense when you think about it. To ensure that the newly adapted warriors were stable and did not, for example, just go insane or suffer catastrophic organ failures. Yet, it's this overlap that some might suggest was itself ultimately a trigger for the downfall of the Thunder Warriors, creating suspicion and jealousy. The Thunder Warriors were known for being more brutal and more mentally unstable, or that's what we're told anyway. So it's possible that once the Thunder Warriors saw the writing on the wall, they realized their days were numbered. Who knows how it all finally ended, but we know that they would be extinguished in a large massacre. Some eluded capture, but none are known to have existed to this day in the 42nd millennium. So, once the Proto-Astartes were stabilized and formed into some 20 regiments of barely 100 warriors each, the Emperor would then call upon the warriors of the many conquered tribes of Terra to further strengthen and build his mighty legions of superhuman warriors. The inclusion of genetic material from the Primarchs into each of these 20 regiments did unknowingly imbue the warriors with certain characteristics and traits. And it appears this was at least one reason as to why the newly formed Space Marines were assigned specific legions to which they were then permanently assigned. In these early days, unlike the modern strict Codex Astartes chapters of the 41st millennium, the legions of the 30th millennium had no limitations on legion numbers. So depending on the requirements and pressures during the Emperor's Great Crusade, many of the legions quickly grew from hundreds to tens of thousands. A great many of these early legions would not immediately wear the distinctive colors we know today. There were no Ultramarines, Blood Angels, and Imperial Fists, Alpha Legion, or Emperor's Children. They still wore the plain gray armor painted with the Thunderstrike symbol of the Emperor and his Thunder Warriors. Also, not even their armor was universally consistent, because of the fast development. Much of the armor used still contained elements of Thunder armor, and was often cannibalized from techno-barbarians that they'd fought previously. Unlike their precursors, the Thunder Warriors, these newest Astartes had a greater sense of honor and brotherhood, and so their armor would begin to become embellished with the marks of achievement and distinction for respect and recognition between one another for their achievements. And this is where you start to see things like purity seals come in. It's a commitment to achieve a certain act on the battlefield, and if you survive and it is left intact, you have achieved that. And it's a demonstration of your ability as a warrior. In the later period of the 41st millennium, this has had religious connotations, but originally it was really a warrior symbol between each other, a sort of mark of respect. So this would process and develop into each legion having their own livery and theme and name. And this was sometimes given by the Emperor himself, but for others, it was a result of their literal combat style. And not all of this happened at equal times either. There was no set date for legions to emerge all simultaneously, with colors as a big reveal. For example, the Death Guard were originally known as the Dusk Raiders, and their origin was still tied to the period of the Unification Wars before the Crusade had even begun properly. Their armor was painted dull crimson, meant to represent their preferred strategy of assaulting at dusk. and this would later change during the Crusade to the bright white of the Death Guard, when they were reunited with Mortarion. But then, in contrast, you may have something like a regiment like the 13th Legion. We were briefly known, while I still had some involvement in the period of unification, as the Warborn. However, as they were disconnected from the affairs on Terra, made their first victories in the Sol system, it referred to generally just as the 13th Legion. In fact, where many legions quickly developed colors that had some significance, the 13th were a bit slower to do so. Some, after certain victories, would paint a color relevant to a specific battle or victory to their shoulder pauldrons, but it was nothing more notable than that. They embraced the numerical assignment more about their legion. One of their first overall commanders noting that, "I'm told that once the numeral 13 was taken as an ill omen by the weak-minded and those enslaved by the lies of superstition. But in the Emperor's service, we shall make it a byword for redemption and glory." Once the 13th Legion had been finally reunited with their Primarch, their armor would become the familiar blue chased gold, wearing the Ultima heraldry that was known to have been seen printed on stellar charts, dating to the period before their isolation in the system. So for the Astartes, their armor design could originate from events and deeds, or it could more simply be just chosen by their Primarch as best suited his wishes. This was repeated often where a legion had built up its own system understanding of armor embellishment, only to have their Primarch wash it all away. And this was noted perhaps more starkly, as I said already, with the Dusk Raiders, who were torn of their Terran heritage and slathered with the white and green of the Death Guard. Moreover, as the legions progressed, depending on the success of their campaigns, they needed to replace their losses. In the case of some legions, especially those who would later turn to heresy, this practice would allow for slow-growing fractures to form inside their brotherhoods, where those of Terran heritage, who were almost universally loyal to the core for the Emperor, would find their newly created legion brothers held something of a different end view that was difficult to pinpoint, but had suddenly become clear enough in the mass slaughter to follow when the heretics came out into the open. And out of necessity began their abandonment of the Emperor by killing most of those who were the original members of the legions and who had sprung from Terra itself, would never turn traitor. But for those Marines who had only ever known loyalty to their Primarch and had been born out in the darkness of the galaxy, it was an entirely different matter. As the Astartes legions forged their way into the galaxy, they encountered many new enemies. Some worlds would welcome their reunification into the new Imperium of Man. Others would resist it with every breath in their bodies. Human worlds were always initially approached with diplomacy. This was meant to be a peaceful, joyous voyage of discovery and connection. But for many civilizations during the Age of Strife, in the time since they had forgotten completely that there ever was any galactic federation of humanity, although they had actively chosen to have nothing to do with such a thing now, other worlds had simply regressed into barbaric apocalypse or a pre-medieval state. All of these situations proved challenging, and each new world required its own specific approach. Yet, where resistance was met, sometimes they were heavily armed or had been plagued by Xenos, not to mention the Xenos the Marines would encounter as part of their explorations. Regardless, the bottom line is losses mounted, and the Astartes needed to replace numbers to bolster their forces as they went deeper into space. This wide expansion underlined something that many had long suspected. There was a powerful link between the Primarchs and the development of their specific legions. At the same time, the legions being reunited with their Primarchs had closed down an impending crisis in that they'd been required to rely upon their own gene seed ever since leaving Terra. and this had been slowly diminishing in stability. Like so many examples, when you make a copy of a copy of a copy, each process degrades that quality, until eventually the material left with is not suitable or stable enough to make new copies. Of course, the provision being, unless you have a suitable original base starting point. This is why, when you're, for example, printing money, you'll have a plate system so that plate isn't going to degrade in quality. But if you had a cheaper or a less well-made original as you use it, it's going to slowly wear. And that's the problem that the Astartes had when they're going out into the galaxy. They only had their own genetic material, and so it just became weaker and more unstable, random mutations and so on as it went along. And for different legions, this was more problematic than for others. Also, to be absolutely clear, this is not to suggest Marines were cloning themselves. That's not what happens. But their base genetic material, their gene seed, was what had to be replicated to form the starting point of the Astartes conversion process. And this brings us along to something known as Crabbe's theorem. A conclave of the Emperor's gene rights were all too aware of the problem facing the Astartes, and so they put forth a suggestion, to them known as Crabbe's theorem. This revelation to the Astartes, so it's worth remembering a lot of scientists themselves, stated that a Primarch's genetic code could be used to actually stabilize and expand their current gene seed store, and that by doing so, it would significantly reduce any mutations from the baseline genetic code. The Primarchs were in essence the plate that I'm talking about in terms of printing. They are a stable constant which enables many more Marines to be produced because their gene seed has so much higher quality. However, this discovery of what seems to be a perfect solution is where another of what I would class as the lesser-known facts about the Emperor becomes exposed. The battles and often grinding attrition that had been taking place were consistently wearing down the Astartes of legions, and so there was a need to replace them and replace them faster and faster. The sensible thing would have been to slow down the expansion, to set up facilities and allow your forces to replenish before pushing on. But in the eyes of the Emperor, this was not an option. He demanded that there be no respite, no slow in the Crusade's progress. And this meant the only option was to create more Astartes, and faster than had been achieved by means of using standard gene seed cultivation. So, in addition to Crabbe's theorem, they implemented accelerated gene culturing techniques, along with previously unavailable genetic engineering technology, and that would greatly reduce the processing time required to create an Astartes from many years to as little as even a single year. It was the Emperor himself, against the advice of his scientific advisors, who chose to push forward and force a highly accelerated gene seed cultivation with a total lack of quality control, coupled with aggressive psycho-indoctrination and mental strengthening techniques. The core of the matter seems to be that the Emperor was more concerned with the progression and the push of the Crusade and its success than he was with the health and well-being of those under his ward. So, it's with little surprise that these processes were later found to have caused fundamental flaws in the Astartes that had been subjected to the poor quality gene seed as a result of these processes. Now, many know the flaws in the various Astartes chapters, even in the 41st millennium. Some lack the organs of other Astartes due to the degradation in genetic quality. For some, their own genetic code became basically unviable. But few people seem to remember that it was the Emperor's demand to create larger Space Marine legions at accelerated speed that either degraded their genetic quality or concentrated emotional and physical flaws presented by their Primarchs, which played a crucial role in the degradation of the stability and sanity of many Space Marine legions. Difficult to assess just how much of a role these actions had during the Great Crusade and also how much they would enable what was still to come. But it's fair to say that primarily through the Emperor's own actions, his desire to push forward and not consider the health of his actual Astartes, you could perhaps harshly say he ended up with damaged materials that would then form the foundations of what would become the horror of the Horus Heresy. Now, I am sure you can appreciate why I'm choosing to include a piece about the heresy in here, but also that I am going to significantly shorten it. The Horus Heresy is what occurs between the early period of the Imperium and the Great Crusade, and then the Second Founding, which is essentially what we might roughly refer to as the modern Imperium. Although in truth, a modern Imperium developed over millennia through a variety of events and different power struggles. Now, why have I chosen not to cover in detail one of the most singularly important events for humanity in this age? The key reason is that, important as this period was, in the grand scheme of things, we can actually summarize it relatively simply. But let me begin by throwing out some anti-imperialistic propaganda, and however you want to cut it, it was in truth the Emperor who created the situation of the heresy. If he was all-knowing as we're led to believe, we can only presume this was part of some grander plan. It's difficult to see how that can be the case given what was to come, but if the Emperor is the be-all and end-all, it seems to be the only conclusion you could draw. Now, although the War Master Horus was the ultimate champion of chaos during this time, it was the legion known as the Word-Bearers and Erebus, who were the instigators and architects of the heresy. You see, the Emperor had brutally chastised the Word-Bearers for perpetuating the belief in the worlds they reunited with the Imperium, teaching its citizens that the Emperor was basically a god to be worshipped. This went terrifically counter to the imperial truth, the rationalist and strictly atheist ideology the Emperor had set out to be the core of his new empire. On discovery of the Word-Bearers' actions, the worlds they conquered were brutally purged, and they themselves were chastised in the most humiliating dressing down possible by the Emperor himself, personally. This essentially broke the will and morale of the Word-Bearers to a point that it left them in a deep state of malaise. They drifted around, and it appears somewhere during this time, their despair was so deep that it was used as a means to manipulate them by the darkness of chaos, first Erebus, and later their Primarch Lorgar. So then, the Word-Bearers positioned events so as to lead Horus down a dark path of corruption. He thus becomes, via the warp portal at Molech, champion in the material for the dark gods. Yet even then, things had to be taken slowly. The War Master knows he must bide his time and sow the seeds of doubt and distrust to best learn who are his allies and who are his enemies. This subtle bleed of corruption is first shown openly in what was known as the Istvan Third Atrocity, where Horus would unleash the exterminatus virus bombing of the planet, while loyalists from 4 legions were on the surface of the planet. But when we say loyalists, these are loyalists of traitor legions. The legions at this time were still very split and divided, and the intention here was to eradicate the loyalist elements within those traitor legions. This is where Nathaniel Garrow, one of my most favorite Astartes of all time, escapes to deliver the message that Horus has turned traitor to the Emperor in person, a mission that does not go to plan. Garrow would later become the first individual who we would know later as the Grey Knights. His ultimate fate and survival was unknown. The heresy finally breaks out into the open during what would become known as the Drop Site Massacre. Half of the known forces of the Legions Astartes are ordered to crush the traitors at Istvan V. But unbeknownst to them, Horus has turned 3 of the legions already to his service, ensuring the 4th is delayed. The first wave of loyalists, Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders, make planetfall, but are betrayed almost immediately by the second wave of the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and elements of the Word-Bearers, who trap them and then engage in what would be the bloodiest hours ever fought so far in the history of the Astartes. In its aftermath, 3 legions are near enough exterminated. Primarch Ferrus Manus is slain by Fulgrim, and 2 others, Vulcan and Corvus, are missing. The ragtag band of loyalist survivors from the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamander's legions would subsequently become known as the Shattered Legions. As we know, a great many events take place during the heresy: Imperium Secundus, Titan Death, Cawl, the horrors against thousands of worlds which tear themselves apart with doubt and suspicion and corruption, Dark Mechanicum, the Solar War, Prospero, Magnus, of course. It all ultimately comes to the final confrontation in the Siege of Terra. Horus had been barreling towards Terra, seeking his final battle with the Emperor, and a siege upon Terra itself that by any measure seemed to carry with it a high chance of victory for the traitors. The Imperial Fists with Primarch Rogel Dorn had been preparing for this with heavy fortifications. The White Scars Legion also prepared to defend the center of the Imperium, along with the Blood Angels with their Primarch, and 3 entire legions of Mechanicum Titans. And that's not to mention the millions of mortal soldiers, whose numbers I always think are severely underestimated. The brutal and bloody battle of attrition would begin, and it would take some 55 days. Yet, in what appeared to be the final hours, Horus would lower his void shields aboard his battle barge, and the Emperor, with a contingent of Astartes as well as Primarchs, teleported up to engage the War Master. Unfortunately, it was scattered throughout the vast warship. By the time the Emperor reached the bridge, he found to his horror the Blood Angel's Primarch had already been slaughtered by Horus. Thus ensued the legendary battle between the Emperor and his now warp-fueled, formerly favorite son. It's difficult to know how much of Horus the Emperor fought in this battle, and how much he fought the channeled powers of the Chaos Gods themselves. But his realization of his catastrophic failure, his sorrow in seeing the fate of his Primarchs and where this had brought them, meant he would not fight with his full powers. And this left open a weakness that Horus would exploit to mortally wound the Emperor. But despite this, the Emperor still was able to overcome and defeat Horus, not simply slaying him and allowing his soul to be reforged by chaos in the warp. The Emperor would call upon his immense psychic power to completely erase Horus from existence and tear his soul apart, never to be reborn. Rogel Dorn arrived too late to be of any help. He was only able to save the Emperor by carrying him back to Terra so that he might be interred forevermore upon the Golden Throne, a massive machinery that held shut the webway tunnels that had been the Emperor's secretive project. Now, his entire plans for the future of humanity were destroyed, and he would live on, but only as a carrion king. Where still these events would have profound consequences for the next 10 millennia. Even now, in these earliest of times, whispers were being spoken with the Emperor's protestations that he was not a god, but merely man, a secret test for those who could see the truth. Against all the Emperor had taught and strived for, the next 10,000 years would see humanity descend into a dark time of stagnation, fear, rejection of science, and a belief once again in mysticism and religion. The dark irony, of course, being that at the very core of this backward descent and archaic belief system would be the Emperor himself, except in a final sardonic twist. It would be this ever-jealous faith in the Emperor that would not only sustain him for the millennia to come, but also help to shield humanity from the darkness of the immaterial. Music. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, there followed a period known as the Great Scouring, and this is as it sounds, a scouring of the galaxy of any forces and remnants of heretics. The death of Horus had created a power vacuum in the traitors, not to mention the gods of vacuum. Chaos turned their minimal attention away from the affairs of mortals, and this led to most, if not all, the heretics fleeing at speed into the Eye of Terror. The gateway to the warp torn into real space by the near-complete annihilation of the Eldar race and the subsequent birth of Slaanesh, which heralded an end to the Age of Strife. Many of the surviving loyalists had much soul-searching to do after the disastrous outcome of the heresy. The father of humanity was a broken corpse king. Many legions lay in ruin, often their primarchs missing or dead. Thousands of worlds were scorched in a state of complete anarchy or corrupted beyond salvation. It was a bleak period, and the very survival of mankind hung by a thread. It was a very real possibility they were about to enter a new period of conflict that would finally tear apart all that was left of humanity. So there was an immediate need to consolidate imperial forces. Most importantly, draw stricter lines of control to ensure that the forces who remained loyalists could be properly managed and avoid any such disaster again in the near or distant future. The Primarch of the Ultramarines would become the new custodian of the Imperium. And in order to avoid the problems of the heresy that had been in part due to singular individuals like Primarchs wielding gigantic armies of superhuman warriors, he now deemed it prudent if you break down the legions into smaller groups of 1,000 strong Astartes. These would be known as Astartes chapters. Each of these would be marshaled by a chapter master, where a Primarch was not available. And this was what is now known as the Second Founding, but it would not be the last. In fact, some 24 further foundings would occur until we reached the point of the Ultima Founding, technically the 27th, in the last year of Millennium 41. Primarch Guilliman would also implement the Codex Astartes, a strict code to which Marines should adhere to, as well as giving tactical and organizational structures. It is perhaps the most important work ever produced by any Primarch in the Imperium. While not every legion would agree specifically to adhere to its tenets and structures laid out in the Codex, all were some or all happy with the breaking apart of their legions, something which is entirely understandable. All eventually conceded, generally speaking, that this change was in the best interests of the Imperium and humanity as a whole. The Codex Astartes did not contain just simple guidelines. It held important structural disciplines that would change the way Astartes operated ever since that day. It divided them into tactical roles to the appropriate markings, which set out various doctrines and strategic methodology. It basically distilled the essence of Roboute Guilliman into a vast tome that for the Ultramarines would become the center of their lives. For other chapters, this devotion to the teachings of Primarch Guilliman was less appealing. They tended to take the pieces they wanted that made sense to them, like the organizational and tactical elements, but give the rest a more casual respect. At the same time, it was by the Primarch, and so it did have its place for them in their lives. Another important change during the Second Founding was these new chapters would, instead of crusading around the galaxy as they had done until now, would create a region or sector of space and set up a permanent base of operation. These are usually referred to as fortress monasteries, although some chapters would exist as what are referred to as fleet-based, living permanently on their battle barges, patrolling specific sectors of space or just the galaxy of the Imperium, ready to intercede as necessary. After the heresy, many legions had been devastated by the war, and stocks of Marines obviously had to be replenished. The Ultramarines had come through the heresy as one of the least damaged legions. But this was in part because the 13th Legion had already been a massive force before the fighting had even begun. And the reason behind this was that the Ultramarines were one of the legions that had shown to have one of the more stable gene seed. This had made it very easy for them to recruit and increase their numbers in a stable manner, whereas other legions in the Crusade struggled with depleted or poor quality genetic material. So when the second founding came around, the Ultramarines had a vast number of Astartes that could be redistributed into smaller chapter-size groups. This was often done in a fairly arbitrary way, but understanding the importance to create chapters that would maintain a strong cohesion, the outlook of the Marines was something which needed to be considered. There's an important reminder that the Astartes are not clone troops with no free thought. The individual soldiers are able to formulate their own decisions and views. And this was actually one of the reasons that caused the fracturing of the legions in the heresy. So, it was well recognized that one way to prevent this happening again was to concentrate the Astartes of a similar thinking into chapters where they could freely share their views and ideology without it bleeding into other Marines and causing friction. I suppose in many ways you might say that the Astartes chapters were in some ways a bit of a safe space bubble where they could practice the way they wanted to within the boundaries of the Codex, and without it creating internal divisions like it might have in a legion. The Imperial Fists were a good example of this, because they had Marines that were more zealous followers of the Emperor, and they were taken and reforged into the Black Templars, whereas those who leaned more towards order and Codex discipline formed the Crimson Fists. While most of the chapters, also known as the successors, would develop their own traditions and champions of great deeds, and these were written into their chapter histories, they would never forget their origins. Many chapters, when fighting alongside those of the first founding, whilst no technical superiority existed, the chapters of the first founding, the originals, always maintained an air of command. And figureheads like a chapter master of a first founding chapter would often carry significant unspoken power and are able to unify chapter forces that in reality may have rarely interacted before. Though, in terms of unifying chapters, a fairly extreme example of this is a highly questionable strategy secretly implemented by Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists. Dorn had never really liked the way by which Guilliman had coldly carved up the legions, least of all his own, and in all likelihood, he only agreed to the new Codex and second founding because it was essentially the way the wind was blowing. So, to counteract this, and in his own mind keep together his 7th Legion, Dorn captained an unspoken strategy that he would now embed in the Imperial Fists' successor chapters, and this is known as the Last Wall Protocol. The theory behind it was that should mankind ever face such a huge threat as it did in the heresy, the chapters of the Imperial Fists would reunite. Now the problem with this is that it goes directly against Imperial protocol. Kind of traitorous, really. The entire reason why the Astartes legions were broken apart was to prevent one individual wielding such massive power like that of an Astartes legion. It also seems fairly disingenuous, because the idea that you need a special order to bring Astartes together in a united front is somewhat nonsensical, if they would just do that anyway. No special order is going to make them suddenly become more unified, especially when they spend probably all their time fighting in different parts of the galaxy. The reason the Last Wall irks me a little is because it feels as if this was really a vanity project on behalf of Rogal Dorn. He couldn't tolerate Guilliman disbanding his legion, so he put in a failsafe that even though technically the 7th Legion were broken apart, there was always a safety measure that he could bring them back together again. In fact, even those in the chapters that came from the Imperial Fists were less than happy about this protocol's existence. The Black Templars' High Marshal went on record with the activation of such a protocol brought him displeasure, and that he obeyed this order in protest. So did Sir Baron of the Fists Exemplar. So the last wall was not even a popular failsafe within the forces it was designed to unite, which only serves to highlight its absurdity even further. Music. The last wall was touted as having been the action which saved humanity from the orc rampage known as the War of the Beast, but I find this highly suspect. Such action seems to be far more about the pride and ego of Rogel Dorn, and far less about the security of the Imperium. Now, in fairness, I should point out that there were plenty of other legions and chapters that held some semblance of unity post-Second Founding, the Dark Angels being a notable one who, through their paranoia, liked to keep their cards close to their chests and keep half an eye on each other. But we'll get into all of the other legions and main chapters in good time. But despite this protocol being placed by Dorn, just to avoid being called a hypocrite, Roboute Guilliman, later in the 42nd millennium, as part of his Indomitus Crusade, would of course essentially create a legion of Primaris to go on his huge rampage. So, it seems a little bit hypocritical that he disbanded and basically broke apart the chapters only to then later come to a solution 10,000 years later, where he said, "Well, I guess I need a legion force. Off we go." I think it's important to note that Roboute Guilliman basically did the same thing as Rogel Dorn later down the line, albeit with fair necessity. But nonetheless, he did essentially the same thing as the Last Wall Protocol, just with Primaris instead of standard Marines. The most important thing is that the Second Founding was one of the most drastic actions taken in the history of the Imperium, the entire restructuring of its entire military forces, and that would set the standard for the next 10,000 years. Not to mention the implementation of the structure of governance known as the High Lords of Terra, which seemed like a good idea at the time but, as with almost all bureaucratic systems, would slowly choke and suffocate the Imperium under the weight of indecision and administration while strangling humanity with a rope of red tape. In the years following the heresy, it was a time of revenge, of disorganization, of traitors seeking to evade justice. That anything constructive was salvaged at all is something of a miracle. Some of those chapters established during the Second Founding may exist now only as a scrawled footnote written hastily on some administrative document long since lost. There was great confusion in the aftermath of the heresy. No one could immediately know who to trust. And so, for the Imperium, time-important things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend. Legend became myth. And for 2,500 years, the ring passed. Wait, again, confused here. For 10,000 years, the Imperium would keep the forces of darkness at bay, surrounding the Eye of Terror with vast fleets and some of humanity's most ferocious defenders. Most important of all stood Cadia, the gateway to the immaterial. Yet Guilliman, even at the end of the heresy, could see that their success in defeating the traitors was nothing you could call permanent. It was only a matter of time before the dark forces poured forth from the warp again with finally strength enough to deluge the Imperium. And if Guilliman wanted to defend humanity, he needed to lay out plans with a greater vision than having a few Space Marine chapters form to join a legion. This is where Primarch Guilliman becomes something of a controversial figure in his decisions, and not only in his actual choices, but in his use of a controversial figure. A figure who was unusual even now, but someone who would be viewed later as dangerous and even heretical. Someone who held a rare connection to the very origins of the Astartes. The true scientist, an innovator, perhaps the very last of mankind's real scientific thinkers. Guilliman would entrust to them the mission of such vital importance that it could determine the very survival of mankind. he would entrust his most valuable project to one Belisarius Cawl. Music. In the aftermath of the heresy in the second founding which followed, Roboute Guilliman had a vision far beyond breaking apart the legions of the Astartes. He tasked Belisarius Cawl to develop a new breed of space marine who he believed would be needed to face an even darker future that was inevitably awaiting humanity. And for now, it had been simply postponed. The devastation of the heresy had highlighted the true danger humanity faced, and that it was far more grim than the Xenos of the galaxy. Although that might be questionable when the Imperium would finally encounter the Tyranids. Guilliman was always looking ahead. He was a visionary tactician and policymaker, and so saw the need to future-proof the Astartes should anything happen to him before the darkness returned, which it did not long after, when Guilliman would be mortally wounded by Fulgrim and was then put into a state of permanent stasis by his Ultramarines. Before this, however, he had entrusted to Cawl many artifacts of incalculable value, but most notably the Primaris Portum. And he would begin his great work to create the next generation of Space Marines, the Primaris. Due to Cawl's interpretation of his orders, these new Primaris were not released until the end of the 41st millennium and the dawn of the era Indomitus. All Space Marines developed since the first founding, excluding those with genetic flaws who do not possess every organ, held 19 specialized organs originally derived from their Primarch's gene code. Primaris Marines, however, were implanted with a further 3 additional organs. Were through the use of the Primaris Portum allowed Cawl to make this breakthrough, and subsequently resulted in this new breed of Astartes. The Primaris finally were displayed to the Imperium as they were presented to Guilliman after his resurrection at the very end of M41. This new breed of Marine were then deployed as part of what Guilliman had titled the Ultima Founding. The Primaris were a last best hope for humanity in a galaxy literally torn apart by 10,000 years of conflict, which concluded with the total destruction of Cadia during Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. The Indomitus Crusade, which followed as Guilliman's reaction to the now actively invading forces of chaos, saw the Primaris Space Marines deployed throughout the galaxy to lend their strength wherever it was needed. Yet the sudden appearance of Primaris did not sit well with all. There were those, even now, who perceived the Primaris as being perversions of the Emperor's perfection, that they are genetic aberrations, an insult to the Astartes of the Emperor's design. Many Astartes themselves struggled between accepting the edict of Emperor Commander, who was after all a Primarch of the Emperor, and a being who they could never, with any fiber of their being, question his actions or plans, even if they were a chapter with no lineage to the Ultramarines. But they were also wrought with the belief that an inhuman mechanicus monster such as Cawl could never produce beings that shared the mastery that the Golden Emperor of mankind was able to produce. These prejudices notwithstanding, however, likely only exacerbated after millennia of ever-backward thinking, which was only made worse by the ecclesiarchy. Saw Cawl observe how the Primarch DNA located within the Primaris Portum proved even more potent and purer than that used to create the original gene seed lines for the existing firstborn Space Marines. This meant that Cawl was able to produce the Primaris with further genetic enhancements beyond those of the firstborn Astartes, something that would be unknown, of course, to most servants of the Imperium. But it brings us to something only we can know, which is that Cawl in, let's say, his previous life, would probably be the best way of phrasing it, worked on the original Astartes project. And while the Emperor was involved in this, it was not his singular effort. In fact, the Emperor employed an army of scientists, gene wrights, and technicians who assisted in completing the Astartes project. So, it's misleading to suggest that no other scientist could ever rival his work. In fact, I think the Emperor would even encourage someone like Cawl to learn beyond. This was, after all, the ideology the Emperor championed. It may only be accurate to say that none could achieve his mastery in creating the Primarchs themselves, for these were no mere transhuman genetic advancements. They were to all intents and purposes demigods. What of the Sancprimus Portum? What was this magical vessel that Guilliman was able to use to hold the genetic material of the Primarchs so securely? For this, we need to rewind to the launch of the Great Crusade in the latter part of Millennium 30. The Emperor was impatient to reach out and bring the first off-world colony into his control. More importantly, Luna, orbiting Terra, contained a great deal of knowledge that the Emperor greatly coveted and would prove to be essential in his ongoing expansion. And so would begin the first pacification of Luna. The Selenar gene cults who called Luna home during the Age of Strife and the Unification Wars possessed highly advanced genetic engineering technology that would be of great use to the Emperor. Despite multiple attempts at diplomacy, the gene cults refused all. As with many worlds during the Crusade, the Age of Strife had been long, and many peoples of the former Galactic Federation of Man had now developed their own civilizations and had little interest in rejoining some grandiose galaxy-spanning empire. They just wanted to be left to their own devices. This was obviously unacceptable, though, for the Emperor, and required him to use all of his subtlety, his tact, and finesse. His solution: to immediately unleash 3 proto-space marine legions upon Luna to bring the world into imperial compliance. Even as the unification wars continued to rage across the surface of Terra itself, Luna was a strange outpost of resurrectionist gene cults. Each of these Selenar cults clung to a different set of prime examples of humanity. Each cult member was a product of creation by the gene rights according to designs originating from the dark age of technology. Resurrected, embodied time and again, they sought to distill down the true personification of a single human to what they considered to be the most true and ideal form, a specimen of perfection. This appears to bear some correlation to the development of humanity during its golden age. And it may be that the lunar gene rights were attempting to create what has been referred to as the Golden Men. In their subterranean complexes, these cults held great power, but were simultaneously insular and resistant to the imperial truth. Had this ragtag bag of gene cultists been any form of standard resistance faced by the Imperium during this time, they would have faced the standard process of merciless extermination. But as the gene cults held not only technology, but also knowledge required by the Emperor, things could not be handled quite so bluntly. The Selenar now continued to return the imperial requests for alliance with audacious silence. And as the diplomatic threats became threats of force, the Selenar began to prepare for war, which was, of course, an entirely pointless endeavor. The first off-world conquest of the Imperium took a little over 6 hours and was an almost comical success. Faced with annihilation, Selenar matriarch Heliosa 254 sent her transmission to Terra, calling for the Emperor to call off his wolves. Their society was broken, and their now enslaved gene rights of Luna would help the Emperor to forge the next generation of warriors who would carry mankind's crusade to the stars. One critical outcome of the events that took place here was for the 16th Legion, for they had now earned their name for themselves as the Luna Wolves. Matriarch Heliosa 254 entrusted one of her gene witches with what was known as the Magna Mater in a weak attempt to shield their knowledge from the forces of the Emperor. And she had some success, who managed to keep it hidden for several centuries. When the heresy came to Terra and Luna became occupied by the traitor forces, the guardian of the Magna Mater was forced to send a distress signal, which was answered by loyalists who then forced their way onto Luna to secure the Magna Mater. One Raven Guard, Ignace Carcassi. No, wait. A Raven Guard Astartes was able to retain the artifact and hide it with himself aboard an abandoned void station, putting himself into suspended animation to survive alone. Sharkey noted that the nameplate of the station read Sang Primus Portum, the name by which the artifact would then come to be known by in later centuries. As a result of the Raven Guard's efforts, the Sang Primus Portum was eventually brought before Roboute Guilliman. The Sang Primus Portum was employed by Imperial scientists to store copies of the genomes of each of the 20 Primarchs, which were of a purer and more stable quality than any other known samples. Most importantly, it was significantly more potent compared to the available genetic material of standard Astartes, which makes fair sense because it's DNA from demigod Primarchs. The Primaris are not simply more advanced versions of Astartes, though. They also had prepared for them new armor and weaponry. This sought to combine the most beneficial elements of past armors from the Heresy period, coupled with advances in power armor itself, as well as Cawl's pattern of bolt rifle, new plasma guns, Redemptor dreadnought, repulsor vehicles, and the Overlord gunship. Cawl's development of such things again walks that line of acceptability between the beliefs of the Mechanicus and the wishes of Guilliman, is coupled with the existence of the ecclesiarchy, are a problem for Guilliman, who, waking up after some 10,000 years, found the Imperium to be not as he remembered it, that some tolerance and diplomacy would be needed if he were to prevent the Imperium from descending into yet another massive civil war. The existence of Cawl's work and its deployment, effective use, however, as well as his hardware, demonstrates that Guilliman at least has the intention to return the Imperium to a time of rationalism and scientific advancement. Guilliman had directed Cawl to divide half of the newly awoken Primaris Marines into new chapters of Astartes. Each of these new chapters would be composed of Primaris who originated from one of the 9 original Loyalist gene lines. The other half of the Primaris force created by the Ultima founding would be divided also into 9 forces, but they were commanded to the size of the vast legions of the Horus Heresy era, with one significant difference. These forces were created from a mixture of Primaris Marines belonging to all 9 of the Loyalist Primarchs' genetic lines. Each Primaris wore the livery of his progenitor Primarch. In each unnumbered Sons Legion was further divided into chapter-sized units of 1,000 Primaris. Guilliman had ordered the unnumbered Sons to fight as mixed genetic line units in the hope that the Primaris may demonstrate something that the Emperor had clearly thought not possible with his original firstborn, Marines. Guilliman hoped that these new Primaris would be able to learn how to deal with different temperaments, viewpoints, personalities of their brothers. Guilliman believed that this experiment could prevent another slow fracturing of trust and ego that had culminated in the heresy. Guilliman's mixed, unnumbered sons proved to be a powerful and resilient force during the course of Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, to retake the Imperium of Man from the incursions of chaos. And to a large extent, Guilliman was proven to be right in his thinking that a mixed force originating from different Primarch genetic material were more than capable of cooperation. However, a lot of that probably has to do with the stability Cawl provided in the Primaris. However, Guilliman's crusade had become a grinding affair. By the 2nd century of M42, his unnumbered sons' numbers began to dwindle. This was not always as a result of losses, but often because whenever the crusade encountered chapters of firstborn Astartes who were struggling to maintain combat-efficient fighting strength, the Lord Commander ordered members of the unnumbered sons of the same genetic heritage to become replacements for the depleted chapter's losses. While the Primaris were clearly capable of working together in unity, Guilliman was still well aware this was unlikely the case for standard Astartes, and what he did not want to do was create any further division. As there had been so many foundings since the second founding initiated by Guilliman, this did give the Primaris great flexibility by which they could support other chapters. For example, Primaris, whose progenitor Primarch was Guilliman himself, could become Ultramarines chapter Primaris Marines, Doom Eagles. Even Ultramarines Primaris serve Rogel Dorn could be Black Templars, Crimson Fists, Imperial Fists, and so on. This was not the only way they could be deployed, however. Sometimes Guilliman simply created a whole new chapter of Primaris Space Marines from the unnumbered suns to defend a strategically important Imperial world, or to form a new fleet chapter to patrol a sector of space which held no worlds of singular importance, but were generally worth bolstering defense for. This was the rationale behind my own custom Primaris chapter. Strangely, though, these all Primaris chapters were not mixed as were the Grey Shield Primaris, and instead they were composed of only a single Primarch's lineage, like standard chapters. The conclusion of Guilliman's crusade, only 20,000 Primaris formed the unnumbered suns, and this is where Guilliman would bring the Indomitus Crusade to a close. He would disband the remaining mixed force of Primaris as he returned to aid in the plague wars of Ultramar. Some of the Primaris formed into new chapters, and the remaining unnumbered suns dispersed to already established chapters where they would hopefully pass forward the lessons they learned, fighting as a part of a mixed force of Astartes, comprising different lineages into those who contained units descended only from their original Primarch. Now, I personally find the conclusions here of Guilliman to be somewhat at odds with the goals that he seemed to set out to achieve. His intention in creating the unnumbered suns had been to mix and demonstrate the Primaris could work together where the former had not. This appears to have been a resounding success, but then at the end of it all, even when creating all new all-Primaris chapters, he decided they should still all be from the same lineage. This seems a very bizarre, counterproductive effort, especially after it had been very clearly successful. It makes sense that when adding Primaris into existing chapters, they should contain the same lineage to prevent more friction than is already likely going to be present. And it's a wise and admirable effort in having the Primaris work together in the first place as a mixed group, but then separate them down to chapters of their lineage to then gently infuse the knowledge of their experiences so that in the future perhaps any new Marine can originate from any loyalist Primarch's genetic template. Then Guilliman chose to set the all-Primaris chapters to be those just from singular lineage, and that just makes no sense to me. I can't see the true purpose for that when it had already been proven to be a successful thing, beyond just maintaining the lineage. But then, if you're going to do that anyway, why bother in the first place? It seems a very strange contradiction. But the Indomitus Crusade came to a close, and the Primaris were now an established part of Space Marine forces all across the galaxy. One thing is for sure, though. The introduction of Primaris Marines at such a critical moment was a huge gamble on the part of Roboute Guilliman. The Space Marines are nothing if not traditionalists. They do not like change. They worship their history and their origins. Some will take this conservative outlook to the extreme over thousands of years. The arrival of the Primaris was certainly tempered by the news of Primarch Guilliman's return as Lord Commander of the Imperium. It seems extremely likely that without this, the consequences could have been far more disruptive and deadly, and likely even would have created a new internal war within the Imperium. Even so, there were those who either expressly or secretively saw the addition of the Primaris into their ranks as either a dilution of their gene stock or an insult to their entrenched beliefs. It's fair to say that others had additional reasons for concern. like the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves. The former having good reason to avoid any external intervention in their affairs, especially the emergence of a loyalist Primarch, which threatened their secretive operations. They were also those Astartes who believed that Primaris, being stronger and closer genetically to Primarchs themselves, was an effort to make them obsolete, just as happened, probably not to their knowledge, with the Thunder Warriors so long ago. No amount of logical rationalization could calm these fears. Some even feared they may simply be subject to mass execution. This was understandable given that the Primaris of the Ultima founding had been inducted into chapters with little or any say about the matter, while former aspirants had been required to sacrifice everything that they've ever known to join. The Primaris were here and ready to go. A bigger question was spoken out by some, an obvious question that could not be put back into the bottle once it had been said aloud. Could it be possible for a Space Marine to be transformed into a Primaris, to gain the benefits of Mechanicus Archaeotech, yet still retain their personality and experience? Many a call girl, chapter master of the Ultramarines, that asked this of Belisarius Cawl already and discussed with those of his fellow chapter masters whom he was able to meet in person. Cawl had already considered this and expected it as a question. He had amassed significant theoretical data on the subject and put forward there would be a 61. Music, music. Music, music. Music 6% failure rate, until of course he was able to experiment further on living Astartes to perfect the process, as well as additional time to carry out research. There was also, of course, the moral concern of whether such a transformative process should even be attempted at all. Some claimed this new development to be the ultimate destiny of all the Astartes, while others urged caution. Some even whispered of heresy. The final conclusion was, in essence, that the genie was out and the Primaris were here. No amount of discussion was going to change that. And until the question of Primaris transformation had been demonstrated by either success or catastrophic failure, it would never go away. So it was the chapter master, Marneus Calgar, who stepped up as the first official test subject from the ranks of his storied chapter. The operation to transform Calgar from a traditional Astartes into a Primaris would be conducted by Cawl and his assistants. Calgar would soon discover that the creation process of Primaris had not been an easy one for the test subjects. In fact, many Primaris Marines did not enjoy being in the presence of Belisarius Cawl. Their visions of torture that he had put them through as he experimented on them whilst fully conscious would never be distant enough to ease their painful memories. The surgery was going to be extensive and agonizing, as Cawl seemed more than happy to describe through tediously explicit descriptions of the process. A Primaris is gifted 3 new organs in addition to the original 19. These are grafted and chemically implanted into aspirant Space Marines. The first is known as the Magnificat, which is buried deep in the brain to stimulate growth and intensify other organ function. The second is the Belisarian furnace, which releases a saturation of hypersteroids and corticosteroids when a mortally dangerous wound is dealt to a Primaris, to enable them to continue to fight. And third are the sinew coils. These are cable-like lengths of durasteel that will encase every tendon, every sinew, in a metallic sheath that gives tremendous resilience and strength, and something which seems a curiously Mechanicus-inspired adaptation. During the traumatic implantation process, Calgar was strapped to the marble slab in the med lab and cut completely from crown to heel. His rib cage was cracked apart, and his physical body became suppressed to the point that his life slipped out of him. Choirs of cyber cherubs sang blissfully mesmerizing requiems, swaying their aspergillum with typical Mechanicus-esque incense that it might guide Calgar's soul back to his body. The skull-faced surgeons clicked and muttered and stabbed at the chapter master's tortured flesh for what would feel like an age. Those watching from around the periphery of the apothecarian looked on with a growing feeling of dread and despair. Had they sacrificed a legendary chapter master merely to quell curiosity? The clicking, whirring surgeons closed up Calgar's wounds, and his hearts were electrically stimulated back into life. The rebuilt Marneus Calgar emerged from his foggy soul void and returned to the world of the mortal living. The shock of this sudden consciousness brought the mighty warrior to break free from his bonds with a roar. His blood sprayed off from his body onto the marble slab. He stumbled to his feet. His newly implanted Belisarian furnace powered him to instant readiness. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar had somehow clawed his way back from the brink of death, and in doing so, he had shown to his chapter and to all Space Marines of the Imperium that the transformation was possible. Highly traumatic, slow, and dangerous, but possible. And in an ever-appropriate historical metaphor, the Primaris Rubicon had been crossed. Now, a new path was opened for all the Astartes.